The sun rose over the quiet neighborhood of Willow Creek. Birds chirped and children rode their bicycles along the clean streets. Among the rows of neatly painted houses, one home stood out. It belonged to Samir, a calm and careful man who worked for a federal police task force. To the neighbors, he seemed like an ordinary person, but his life was anything but ordinary. Samir loved his Jeep. It was red, strong, and reliable. He had spent years customizing it, adding gadgets and safety features that only someone in his line of work would understand. The Jeep sat proudly in his driveway every morning, shining under the early sun. Samir often checked it, making sure everything was perfect before leaving for work. Willow Creek had strict rules, enforced by the Homeowners Association, known as the HOA. Their president, Karen, was well known for her love of rules. She walked her neighborhood in the mornings, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning every lawn, every driveway, every car. To her, order and perfection mattered more than anything else. Some neighbors found her strict, others found her amusing, but everyone knew not to cross her. On this particular morning, Karen noticed Samir's Jeep. She stopped in front of it and frowned. "That Jeep has no parking permit sticker," she muttered to herself. She had been keeping track of all vehicles in the neighborhood. Samir had always been careful, but this morning, he had forgotten to place the sticker on the windshield. Karen's sense of duty flared up. She marched to the front door of her own house and picked up her phone. "I have to handle this now," she said, determined. She called the HOA office and explained that a vehicle was violating the rules. The officer on the line reminded her that Samir had been a model resident, but Karen insisted, "Rules are rules. Someone must act." Meanwhile, Samir was inside his house, drinking coffee and planning his day. He had no idea that Karen had set her sights on his Jeep. He reviewed the schedule of his federal task force, noting meetings, investigations, and equipment checks. His mind was focused on work, not on the drama brewing just outside his driveway. Karen returned to the Jeep with a small toolkit. She wore gloves and sunglasses, projecting confidence. She examined the lock carefully. "Just a small adjustment," she whispered. "It's for the good of the neighborhood." She began working on the lock, twisting and cutting with careful movements. In her mind, she was enforcing order and protecting the community. From the street, a neighbor watched curiously. May, an elderly woman who loved gardening, noticed Karen working on the Jeep. She shook her head. "Karen takes rules too seriously," May said softly to herself. She decided not to intervene. Willow Creek had its own way of letting things happen, and neighbors often preferred to stay out of Karen's path. Back inside, Samir finished his coffee and walked to the front door. He noticed Karen by the Jeep. "Good morning, Karen," he said politely. Karen froze and looked up. "Good morning, Samir. I'm just making sure everything is in order," she replied, trying to appear calm. She moved quickly as if to hide the toolkit in her bag. Samir nodded, his eyes scanning the Jeep. "It looks fine from here," he said, smiling lightly. He had no idea what Karen had just done. He waved and returned inside. Karen stayed behind for a moment, checking the lock one last time. In her mind, she had done her duty. As the day continued, life in Willow Creek seemed normal. Children played, neighbors greeted each other, and the sun climbed higher. But something had changed. The Jeep, which had always been a symbol of Samir's careful planning, now carried an invisible tension. Karen had acted, and she did not know the full story behind the vehicle she had touched. Samir went about his morning routines, unaware that the Jeep was no longer just a vehicle. It was connected to a larger world, one full of mystery, danger, and federal investigations. Karen, on the other hand, walked away feeling proud of her action. She had protected the neighborhood, she thought. She had enforced the rules. Little did either of them know, this ordinary morning was about to turn into an extraordinary story. The simple act of cutting a lock would set off a chain of events that neither Samir nor Karen could have imagined. And by the time the sun reached its highest point, Willow Creek would feel a shift in its peaceful rhythm, the kind of shift that begins with a single, small decision. The day moved slowly in Willow Creek. Samir had left for his office, leaving the red Jeep behind. Inside his house, everything seemed quiet and normal. But outside, Karen could not stop thinking about the vehicle. She walked back to her own home, but her mind kept returning to the Jeep. She imagined it parked without a proper sticker, and she felt a rush of responsibility. Karen had always believed that rules were the backbone of the neighborhood. She liked the neat lawns, the clean sidewalks, and the orderly garages. To her, one mistake, even a small one, could lead to chaos. The Jeep, in her eyes, was a sign that someone was not following rules. Her determination grew stronger with each step she took. Meanwhile, Samir's neighbor, Carlos, noticed Karen lingering near Samir's driveway. Carlos was a friendly man who enjoyed chatting with everyone in the neighborhood. He waved at Karen, smiling. "Morning, Karen," he said. "Everything okay?" Karen nodded, but her face looked serious. "Just making sure the neighborhood is safe," she replied firmly. Carlos raised an eyebrow but decided not to ask more questions. In Willow Creek, Karen often acted as she pleased, and neighbors had learned that arguing with her rarely ended well. By late morning, Karen returned to the Jeep. She had brought with her a small tool to adjust the lock, thinking it was necessary. She looked around to make sure no one was watching and knelt by the vehicle. "It's just for safety," she whispered to herself. "No one will be hurt." As she worked, a small crowd began to form on the street. Children on bicycles slowed down, curious about the unusual scene. May, the elderly neighbor, watched from her garden, shaking her head slightly. "Why does she always have to do this?" she muttered under her breath. She stayed back, preferring not to interfere. Karen's hands moved carefully over the lock. She had done similar things before when she believed rules were broken. She felt proud of her own courage and determination. The Jeep, to her, was simply another responsibility, a small challenge that she could handle. Back at the office, Samir was busy with his work. He was reviewing reports and checking updates on ongoing investigations. His mind was focused on serious matters, completely unaware that someone had touched the Jeep he valued so much. He often thought about safety and security, but he never imagined that his own neighborhood could be a source of unexpected problems. By early afternoon, Karen had finished her work on the lock. She stood up, dusted her hands, and smiled to herself. "I did the right thing," she thought. She felt satisfied that she had protected the neighborhood. The red Jeep looked no different to anyone else, but in her mind, it was now safe and under control. At the same time, a strange feeling started to settle over the neighborhood. It was subtle at first, a small sense of unease that no one could explain. Carlos noticed that the children were unusually quiet, and May sensed that something unusual had happened. Karen, however, felt only pride. She had done what she believed was necessary. When Samir returned home that evening, he noticed something unusual. The Jeep was in the same place, but the lock had marks on it. His eyes narrowed. "What happened here?" he murmured. He checked the surrounding area carefully. There were no signs of forced entry beyond the lock, no footprints, no tools left behind, nothing except the subtle scratches that told him someone had tampered with it. Samir's training kicked in immediately. He did not panic. He knew that in his work, careful observation and quick thinking were important. He examined the Jeep, noting the minor changes and the unusual marks. He knew that whoever had touched it had no idea what they were dealing with. Meanwhile, Karen, back in her house, was enjoying her evening. She made tea and sat by the window, watching the quiet street. She felt accomplished. The Jeep was safe, the rules were enforced, and everything seemed perfect. In her mind, she had protected the neighborhood from disorder. Little did Karen know, her actions had begun a chain of events that would be impossible to control. The Jeep was not just any vehicle, it belonged to a federal police task force. The moment she had touched it, she had unknowingly involved herself in something far bigger than neighborhood rules. As the sun set over Willow Creek, the streets glowed with a warm, peaceful light. Neighbors returned to their homes, children laughed quietly in their yards, and the air smelled faintly of flowers and fresh grass. Everything seemed calm, but beneath the surface, tension had started to grow. Karen had acted, Samir had noticed, and the neighborhood was about to witness a story that no one could have imagined. The evening ended quietly, but the next day promised surprises, lessons, and revelations that would change Willow Creek forever. The next morning, Willow Creek woke up to another bright day. Sunlight spilled over the rooftops, and the streets buzzed with quiet activity. Samir stepped outside to check his Jeep once more. He noticed the scratches on the lock from yesterday, and his eyes narrowed with concern. He knew this was more than a simple neighborhood rule issue. Someone had interfered with his vehicle, and in his line of work, that was never a small matter. Karen, on the other hand, began her morning walk as usual. She carried her clipboard and wore her determined expression. She checked the street, noting which cars were parked correctly and which lawns needed trimming. As she passed Samir's driveway, her eyes fell on the red Jeep. She smiled to herself, feeling proud that she had already acted yesterday. To her, everything seemed in perfect order. But soon, her smile faded. From across the street, a moving van pulled up. Two men in plain suits stepped out, carrying official-looking equipment. They moved with precision and confidence, scanning the neighborhood as they approached Samir's house. Karen tilted her head, curious but cautious. She had never seen these men before. Samir had already returned from a brief errand when he noticed the men approaching. He instinctively moved to meet them. "Good morning," he said politely, though his mind raced. The men introduced themselves as members of a federal police task force. "We are here regarding your vehicle," one of them said calmly. Samir nodded and invited them to examine the Jeep. Karen, still across the street, watched the scene unfold. Her eyes widened as she realized that the men were inspecting the Jeep in a serious manner. She felt a sudden flutter of unease. Something about the situation seemed different from the usual neighborhood disputes. She had expected a simple warning or a minor report, not this kind of official attention. One of the men turned to Samir. "We need to ensure the security of this vehicle," he explained. "It is part of an ongoing investigation, and it contains equipment critical to our operations. Any tampering could compromise safety." Samir nodded quietly, understanding the gravity of the situation. He checked the Jeep carefully, making sure nothing had been damaged beyond the lock. Karen's heart began to race. Her actions yesterday suddenly seemed much more serious. She realized that cutting the lock, which had felt like a small act of responsibility, might have been a major mistake. She stepped closer, trying to listen without being noticed. Her mind raced with questions and worry. The task force members examined the Jeep thoroughly. They noted the scratches on the lock and the signs of interference. "This appears to have been tampered with," one of them said. "We need to document everything and ensure nothing was compromised." Samir nodded. He appreciated their professionalism, but he could not ignore the fact that someone in the neighborhood had touched the vehicle without knowing its importance. Karen's curiosity turned to fear. She recognized her own actions in the situation. She had cut the lock, thinking it was a small infraction, but now she understood that the consequences could be serious. Her pride was replaced by worry. She stepped back, unsure of what to do, but too nervous to approach Samir or the officials. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice the unusual activity. Cars slowed down as people watched from windows and doorways. May, the elderly neighbor, whispered to Carlos, "Something big is happening. That Jeep is not ordinary." Carlos nodded, equally curious. The quiet neighborhood had never seen such an official presence before. The task force worked efficiently, documenting the Jeep and checking the equipment inside. They reassured Samir that no critical systems appeared to be damaged. However, they emphasized the importance of security and warned that any further interference could lead to serious consequences. Samir listened carefully, understanding the need to protect both his vehicle and the ongoing investigation. Karen finally gathered the courage to step forward. She approached slowly, hands raised slightly. I touched the lock yesterday," she admitted nervously. "I thought it was a minor issue. I didn't know." Her voice trailed off. Samir turned to her, surprised but calm. The task force members also noticed her presence, but they remained professional, observing without immediate judgment. Samir's mind raced. He could see that Karen had acted out of habit and a sense of duty, not malice. But he also knew that her actions could have put sensitive work at risk. He nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest," he said. "This situation is serious, but understanding and communication are important. Rules and safety both matter, but we also need awareness." Karen felt a mix of relief and continued worry. She realized that her strict enforcement of rules had collided with something far beyond her understanding. She promised herself silently that she would be more careful in the future. As the day progressed, the task force completed their inspection and reassured Samir that the Jeep was secure. Karen returned to her home, reflecting on the morning's events. She understood that responsibility was not just about rules, it was also about understanding the situation before taking action. By evening, Willow Creek seemed calm again. The unusual visitors had left, the street was quiet, and the red Jeep gleamed in the sunlight. But the morning's events had changed something fundamental in the neighborhood. Karen had learned a lesson, Samir had maintained control of a critical asset, and Willow Creek now carried the memory of a day when a small action nearly turned into a serious problem. The next morning in Willow Creek felt different. The sun shone as usual, but the air carried a quiet tension. Neighbors whispered among themselves, noticing the red Jeep parked in Samir's driveway. Children rode their bikes cautiously, sensing that something unusual had happened. Samir stepped outside, checking the Jeep carefully. The lock was fine now, but he knew the previous day's events had left an invisible mark. Karen, as always, began her neighborhood walk. She carried her clipboard but moved more slowly than usual. Her mind replayed yesterday's events. The federal officers, the scrutiny, the realization that her small action had interfered with serious work. It weighed on her. She felt a mix of pride in her dedication to rules and fear of the consequences she might face. From her porch, May observed Karen walking with an unusual hesitation. "She looks different today," May said quietly to Carlos, who had come out to water his plants. "Maybe she's thinking about what happened with that Jeep." Carlos nodded. "It seems like she's realizing that rules aren't always simple," he replied. Meanwhile, Samir had received a call from his office. They needed him to check some critical equipment in the Jeep. He knew the neighborhood had become more complicated because of yesterday's interference. He decided to carefully plan his inspection without causing alarm among neighbors. He retrieved the keys and started the Jeep, testing systems quietly and efficiently. Karen noticed Samir moving toward the vehicle and stopped in her tracks. Her curiosity battled with caution. She wanted to know what was happening but also feared being involved in anything serious. She decided to keep her distance, yet she watched intently from across the street. Her attention was so focused that she almost didn't notice another neighbor stepping out of their house. That neighbor, David, had always been friendly with Samir. He walked toward the driveway, greeting Samir warmly. "Morning, David said. Everything okay with the Jeep? Samir nodded politely, masking the seriousness of the situation. Yes, just checking some equipment, he replied. Karen felt a sudden urge to intervene again, but she hesitated. She remembered the warning from the federal officers. Any further action could lead to real trouble. She took a deep breath and decided to step back. Still, her eyes stayed on the Jeep as she walked slowly down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand. Inside the Jeep, Samir tested every system carefully. He opened compartments and checked devices that no ordinary vehicle carried. He had to ensure nothing had been damaged or exposed. Each step required concentration, and he moved with the precision of someone trained to handle high-stakes equipment. From her porch, May noticed Samir's careful movements. She whispered to Carlos, "That Jeep is more than just a car. It's very important." Carlos nodded, his eyes following Samir. The quiet neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as Samir continued his inspection. Suddenly, Karen heard a faint sound from the Jeep, a click she had never noticed before. Her curiosity flared, but fear kept her frozen. She realized that her past actions might have caused this sound. She had cut the lock, and now the vehicle was reacting in a way she didn't understand. She stepped back further, feeling both relief and anxiety. Samir, focused on his task, did not notice Karen watching. He completed his inspection and confirmed that the equipment was safe. He made a note to report the minor interference to his team, knowing that someone in the neighborhood had unknowingly risked a serious situation. Karen finally turned away and walked slowly back to her home. Her mind replayed the events repeatedly. She understood that rules were important, but knowledge and awareness were even more crucial. Acting without full understanding could lead to unexpected consequences, she realized. By late afternoon, the neighborhood had returned to a quiet routine. Children played in yards, neighbors tended to gardens, and the sun cast a warm glow over Willow Creek. The red Jeep sat in the driveway, calm and unassuming, yet it carried a weight that only Samir truly understood. As evening approached, Karen sat by her window, thinking about responsibility and the importance of caution. She made a promise to herself to be more careful and thoughtful. Samir, inside his home, prepared for the next day, knowing that the neighborhood had learned an invisible lesson about assumptions, curiosity, and the importance of awareness. The day ended quietly, but the events had left an impression. Willow Creek was no longer just a peaceful neighborhood. It had become a place where small actions could ripple into unexpected outcomes. Both Samir and Karen had learned something vital: Samir about vigilance in his line of work, and Karen about the consequences of enforcing rules without understanding the bigger picture. The evening sky turned orange and pink, and Willow Creek seemed to rest peacefully. Yet beneath the calm surface, everyone knew that the story of the red Jeep was far from over. Something larger was waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to test patience, courage, and understanding. The next morning, Willow Creek felt unusually quiet. Samir was up early, checking his Jeep carefully. He had spent the night thinking about yesterday's events. The minor interference with the lock might have seemed harmless to anyone else, but he knew that in his line of work, even small mistakes could have big consequences. Karen, meanwhile, was pacing in her living room. She had barely slept, thinking about the federal officers and the importance of the Jeep. Her usual confidence in enforcing rules was shaken. She realized that her action of cutting the lock had brought her closer to a serious situation than she had imagined. She sipped her tea slowly, trying to calm her nerves. By mid-morning, Samir received a message from his office. They were sending 2 federal officers to address the interference formally. "This is serious," Samir said quietly to himself. He knew that Karen had acted out of her sense of duty, but her actions could have endangered the task force's work. He needed to handle the situation carefully. Karen heard a knock on her door. She hesitated before opening it. 2 men in plain suits stood outside. "Good morning, Mrs. Karen," one of them said politely. "We need to speak with you regarding yesterday's incident." Karen's heart raced. She had expected a warning, not a formal visit from federal officers. "Please, come in," Karen said nervously, stepping aside. The officers entered her living room and took seats. They spoke calmly but clearly. "Mrs. Karen, we understand that you acted with good intentions, but your actions involved a vehicle connected to a federal investigation," one officer explained. "Cutting the lock could have compromised safety." Karen listened, feeling a mixture of fear and regret. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I only wanted to enforce the rules. I didn't mean any harm." The officers nodded. "We understand. Many people would act similarly if they saw what you saw. But this vehicle contains sensitive equipment and is part of ongoing operations. Interference can have serious consequences." Meanwhile, Samir stepped outside and approached the house. He nodded politely to Karen and the officers. "Good morning," he said calmly. "I appreciate your honesty, Karen. This situation is delicate, but we can resolve it with proper communication." Karen looked at him, relieved that he was not angry. Samir's calm approach helped reduce her anxiety. The officers explained the seriousness of the situation in detail. They showed her photos of the equipment inside the Jeep and explained how it supported federal investigations. Karen listened carefully, realizing that her small action had inadvertently interfered with important work. She felt both embarrassed and grateful that Samir was understanding. "We are not here to punish you," the officer said. "We want to ensure that everyone understands the importance of security around this vehicle. Your cooperation is appreciated. Moving forward, we ask that you avoid any interaction with the Jeep or its equipment." Karen nodded eagerly. "I understand completely," she said. She felt a weight lift off her shoulders, though the lesson was clear and unforgettable. Samir then spoke. "Karen, I know you meant well. Rules are important, and your dedication is admirable. But sometimes understanding the full context is just as important as enforcing rules. Today, we can all learn from this." Karen smiled faintly, feeling a mix of relief and humility. She realized that her sense of duty needed to be paired with awareness and patience. After the conversation, the officers left Willow Creek. The neighborhood returned to its quiet rhythm, but the air felt different. Karen walked slowly to her porch, reflecting on the lesson she had learned. She understood that curiosity and rules must always be balanced with knowledge and caution. Samir returned to the Jeep, checking the systems one last time. Everything was intact, and no damage had occurred. He made a note to review neighborhood interactions in the future, realizing that even ordinary people with good intentions could unknowingly affect serious operations. He felt a sense of satisfaction that the situation had been handled calmly and without real harm. By afternoon, Willow Creek seemed peaceful again. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted politely, and the red Jeep sat quietly in the driveway. Karen, sitting by her window, watched the neighborhood with a new understanding. She knew that her actions had consequences beyond what she could see, and she promised herself to act with more care and thoughtfulness in the future. As the sun set, the sky turned orange and pink, casting a warm glow over Willow Creek. The day's events had left a lasting impression. Samir had maintained control of a critical asset, the officers had ensured security, and Karen had learned an important lesson about awareness, responsibility, and the limits of enforcement. The neighborhood returned to calm, but everyone involved knew that life in Willow Creek had changed slightly. A simple act of rule enforcement had turned into a lesson about caution, understanding, and respect for the unexpected. Karen, Samir, and the entire neighborhood now carried this lesson quietly in their minds. The morning sun bathed Willow Creek in soft light. Samir stepped outside and glanced at his Jeep. Everything was in order, but the events of the past few days weighed on him. He had learned to expect the unexpected in his work, but the interference from someone in his neighborhood was a reminder that even ordinary places could become complicated. Karen, too, felt the weight of recent events. She had spent the night thinking about her actions and their consequences. Her usual confidence in enforcing rules was tempered with a new sense of caution. Today, she decided to visit Samir and apologize properly, not just out of fear, but because she genuinely wanted to make amends. Walking slowly across the street, Karen approached Samir's driveway. "Good morning, Samir," she said politely, her voice soft. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened. I didn't understand the importance of your vehicle, and I acted without thinking. I'm truly sorry." Samir looked at her calmly, his expression neutral but kind. "Thank you, Karen. I know you acted with good intentions. It's clear that you care about the neighborhood. But sometimes, care needs to be paired with awareness. We all make mistakes, and what matters is learning from them." Karen nodded, feeling relief and a little pride that Samir was not angry. She realized that understanding and humility were as important as enforcing rules. "I promise I will be more careful," she said. "I will think before I act next time." At that moment, 2 federal officers arrived quietly. They had come to ensure that the vehicle and its equipment remained secure after recent events. Samir greeted them politely, and they began a routine inspection of the Jeep. Karen stood nearby, observing silently. She wanted to help, but she also understood that stepping in could be dangerous or unnecessary. As the officers worked, Karen noticed the careful way Samir handled every part of the Jeep. She could see that this was no ordinary vehicle. It required knowledge, patience, and respect. She felt both awe and a little fear, realizing how serious her actions could have been if they had gone differently. The officers completed their inspection and reported that everything was intact. "No damage occurred," one of them said. "But this situation is a reminder that even small interference can have unintended consequences. We appreciate your honesty, Karen, and we hope this serves as a learning experience for the entire neighborhood." Karen nodded quietly, her mind replaying the events. She realized that her strict adherence to rules had almost caused a serious problem. She thought about how easy it was to assume she was right without understanding the full situation. The lesson was clear and unforgettable. After the officers left, Samir turned to Karen. "Willow Creek is a peaceful neighborhood," he said. "But even here, small actions can have ripple effects. Today, you've learned something important, and so have I. It's a reminder that communication and awareness are just as important as rules and discipline." Karen smiled faintly. "I understand now," she said. She felt a sense of closure, knowing that the tension that had built over the past days was finally easing. She also felt a renewed respect for Samir and the work he did, understanding that some things were beyond ordinary knowledge and experience. By afternoon, the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm. Children played in yards, neighbors chatted by fences, and the red Jeep gleamed quietly in the driveway. Everything seemed calm again, but the recent events had left a lasting impression on everyone. May, watching from her garden, whispered to Carlos, "Willow Creek has learned something. Sometimes, good intentions are not enough." Carlos nodded, smiling softly. The neighborhood had witnessed an unusual lesson, and it would not be forgotten. Karen returned to her home and reflected on the past week. She realized that rules were important, but knowledge, patience, and understanding were equally valuable. She promised herself to act more carefully in the future, aware that even small actions could affect others in ways she might not foresee. Samir, meanwhile, completed his checks on the Jeep and prepared for his next assignment. He felt satisfied that the situation had been handled calmly and responsibly. He had maintained control of critical equipment, resolved the misunderstanding, and ensured that no one was hurt or endangered. As evening fell, the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Willow Creek was peaceful again. The streets were quiet, the neighbors content, and the red Jeep rested safely in its driveway. The events of the past week had changed something subtle but important in the neighborhood. People had learned lessons about awareness, responsibility, and the consequences of even small actions. Karen, sitting by her window, watched the neighborhood with a sense of calm. She understood that life was more complex than rules alone. Samir, inside his home, reflected on the importance of patience and communication. Willow Creek had returned to normal, but everyone carried the memory of the week's events quietly in their minds. The day ended with peace and understanding. Both Karen and Samir had learned valuable lessons. The neighborhood had experienced tension, curiosity, and realization, and now it could rest with the reassurance that even unexpected situations could be resolved through honesty, respect, and awareness. The morning sun shone gently over Willow Creek. The neighborhood felt calm, almost ordinary again, but the events of the past week had left a subtle mark. Samir stepped outside to check the red Jeep one last time. Everything was in perfect order. The lock was secure, the equipment intact, and the vehicle ready for any work the task force required. Karen, walking along the sidewalk with her clipboard, noticed Samir in the driveway. She felt a mixture of relief and curiosity. She had learned an important lesson about caution, understanding, and the consequences of her actions. She decided to greet Samir properly, hoping to end the situation on a positive note. "Good morning, Samir," Karen called politely, approaching with a small smile. "I just wanted to thank you for your patience and understanding this past week. I've learned a lot, and I promise to be more careful in the future." Samir smiled warmly. "Good morning, Karen. I appreciate that. We all make mistakes sometimes. What matters is learning from them. The neighborhood is peaceful again, and that is important for everyone." Karen nodded. She felt a wave of relief. The tension she had carried for days began to fade. She realized that enforcing rules was important, but awareness, patience, and respect were equally crucial. "Thank you for helping me understand," she said. "I'll remember this lesson." Samir glanced at the Jeep, then back at Karen. "Rules and safety are important, but so is understanding what we are dealing with. Not everything is obvious at first glance." Karen listened carefully, realizing that his words were more than advice, they were a life lesson. Meanwhile, neighbors began to notice the calm energy in the street. Children played in their yards, neighbors exchanged greetings, and Willow Creek returned to its quiet, familiar rhythm. May, watching from her garden, whispered to Carlos, "It looks like everything is back to normal." Carlos nodded. "Yes, but I think everyone has learned something important this time." Karen walked back toward her home, feeling lighter than she had in days. She reflected on her actions and how small decisions could have big consequences. She promised herself to act with care, to think before acting, and to communicate whenever she was unsure. This promise brought a sense of peace she had not felt before. Samir returned to the Jeep, running a final check on the equipment. He had learned as well. Even in a calm neighborhood, ordinary people could unknowingly create situations that required attention. He realized that patience and clear communication were just as important as vigilance in his work. He made a note to share this experience with his colleagues so they could be prepared for similar situations. As the day went on, Willow Creek seemed more harmonious than ever. The minor tension of the past week had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding among neighbors. Karen continued her usual walks, but now with a new awareness and careful thought. Samir moved confidently, knowing his work and the neighborhood were secure. By late afternoon, the sun cast a warm, golden light over the streets. Karen stopped by her porch, looking at the red Jeep and Samir. She felt gratitude for his patience and for the lessons she had learned. She understood that actions, even with the best intentions, could have unexpected effects, and that respect for others' responsibilities was essential. Samir waved to Karen from the driveway. "Take care, Karen," he said. "Remember, understanding comes before action." Karen waved back, smiling genuinely this time. She felt proud that she had faced her mistake and learned from it. As evening approached, the neighborhood settled into a peaceful rhythm. Children returned home, neighbors chatted quietly, and the red Jeep rested quietly in Samir's driveway. Willow Creek had returned to its calm state, but everyone carried the lessons of the week quietly in their minds. Karen reflected on how a single small action, a lock cut in the name of rules, could ripple into unexpected situations. She understood now that caution, awareness, and communication were as important as rules themselves. Samir, sitting in his home, reflected on the importance of patience, observation, and understanding the human element even in high-stakes work. By nightfall, the sky over Willow Creek was filled with soft stars, casting a gentle light over the peaceful neighborhood. Karen, Samir, and the neighbors had learned valuable lessons. The red Jeep remained safe, the neighborhood calm, and the people wiser. Willow Creek returned to its ordinary rhythm, but the week's events had made everyone a little more careful, thoughtful, and understanding. In the quiet of the night, Karen whispered to herself, "I will act with care and thought from now on." Samir, looking out at the same stars, thought, even in ordinary places, patience and understanding make all the difference. Willow Creek slept peacefully, carrying a story of curiosity, caution, and growth, a story that would be remembered quietly by those who had lived it, and one that left the neighborhood wiser and closer than before.